Forget the romanticized castles, the golden goblets, and the groaning banquet tables you've seen in every Hollywood epic. For the average medieval peasant, every single meal was a gamble between starvation, sickness, and ingredients so stomach-churning that modern stomachs would revolt at the first bite. The truth of what kept ordinary people alive between 500 AD and 1500 AD has nothing to do with rustic charm. It has everything to do with desperation. Bioarchaeologists studying pottery residues, bone isotopes, and parasite eggs preserved in medieval cesspits have spent decades reconstructing what daily survival actually tasted like. What they uncovered is a 1,000-year horror story of slime, rot, fungus, and fermented sludge. These are the 10 meals that kept Europe's peasants alive, and barely alive at that. Number 10 is the cornerstone of the medieval peasant diet, and arguably the most disturbing thing they ate every single day: pottage. Across England, France, and Germany, every household kept a single iron pot suspended over the hearth, and that pot almost never came down. Inside it bubbled a thick, murky gruel of barley, oats, peas, leeks, cabbage, and whatever scraps had been gathered that morning. The contents were eaten 3 times a day, ladled into wooden bowls and scraped up with horn spoons. But here is where it becomes nightmarish. The pot was never fully emptied. Fresh ingredients were tossed on top of the old, and the same broth simmered on for days, sometimes for entire weeks. At the bottom, a slimy, fermenting layer accumulated like sediment in a swamp. Organic residue analysis at West Cotton in Northamptonshire confirmed lipids from cattle, sheep, and dairy mingled with vegetable matter in pots that had clearly seen continuous use. To medieval peasants, this layered sludge was simply dinner. To modern science, it is a portrait of a microbial wonderland. Number 9 is the bread that wore down their teeth and sometimes drove them mad. Maslin bread was the daily loaf, dark and dense, made from whatever combination of rye, barley, and oats had survived the harvest. The grain was crushed using crude millstones that constantly shed grit and stone fragments into the flour. Skeletal remains pulled from medieval cemeteries show teeth ground down to the gums, with cracked enamel and damaged jaws appearing in nearly every adult skull examined. But the worst was yet to come. When the rye crop became infected with Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus, the resulting bread carried a hidden poison. Entire villages would fall ill with what contemporaries called St. Anthony's fire. Symptoms began with burning sensations in the limbs, escalated into violent convulsions, and ended in gangrene, as fingers and toes blackened and fell off. Survivors described terrifying hallucinations of demons, flames, and writhing snakes. In 944 AD, a single outbreak in France killed thousands of peasants in a matter of weeks, all from the simple act of eating their daily bread. Number 8 comes from the cold forests of the north. When harvests failed in Scandinavia and the surrounding regions, peasants turned to the trees themselves. Bark bread, or bark broad, was made by stripping the inner cambium layer from pine and elm trees, drying it, grinding it into a coarse powder, and mixing it with whatever scraps of flour remained in the household. The result was nutritionally hollow, a stomach filler that swelled bellies without delivering any real sustenance. Records from Sweden, Norway, and Finland document its widespread use during recurring famine years, with entire peasant families surviving on nothing else for the duration of harsh winters. Children raised on bark bread developed swollen abdomens, brittle bones, and the hollow-eyed look of chronic malnutrition. The bread itself was bitter, fibrous, and so dense it sat in the gut like wet sawdust, but for many, it was the difference between life and death. Number 7 is what happened when the autumn pig was slaughtered. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. Blood pudding was made by mixing the warm pig's blood with suet, oats, and chopped onion, then stuffing the entire mess into freshly cleaned intestines and boiling it until firm. The peasants kept what was called the umbles, the heart, liver, lungs, and intestines, while the choice cuts of meat went straight to the Lord's table. This is the literal origin of the phrase eating humble pie. Sheep lungs and cow stomachs were boiled with foraged herbs and stretched across as many meals as possible. On feast days, fresh blood was sometimes drunk warm directly from the throat of a freshly slaughtered animal, considered a vital tonic and a celebration of survival through another lean season. The smell alone in a peasant cottage on slaughter day was reportedly so overwhelming that travelers would alter their routes to avoid passing through villages. Number 6 rose from the sea and traveled hundreds of miles before reaching the inland tables. Catholic Europe demanded fish on every Friday and throughout the long weeks of Lent, and salted herring and stockfish became the cheapest way to comply. Stockfish was air-dried cod from Norway, hammered and shipped across the continent in stacks like firewood. By the time it reached an inland village, it was so hard that it had to be soaked in water for days and then physically beaten with a wooden mallet just to make it soft enough to chew. Salted herring fared no better. Stored in oak barrels for 10 months at a time, the resulting fish gave off a stench so powerful that medieval guild houses had specific rules about where the barrels could be opened. Peasants in landlocked villages routinely ate fish that was already turning rancid, masked with vinegar, salt, and prayers that it would not bring on dysentery before morning. Number 5 is the strange dish that somehow appeared at both peasant funerals and peasant weddings. Fermenting was a wheat porridge boiled in milk or broth, occasionally enriched with a precious pinch of saffron when a wealthy peasant could afford it. The catch was that medieval peasants had no refrigeration, so the milk used was almost always already turning sour. The result was curdled, lumpy, and sharply acidic, a porridge full of textural surprises that no modern palate would tolerate. Stable isotope studies of medieval bones confirm that dairy was a heavy staple of the rural diet, meaning peasants ate this dish constantly. Chunks of stale rye bread were often crumbled on top, soaking up the sour liquid and adding yet another layer of fermentation. And yet, in spite of how it sounds, fermenting was considered celebration food. It appeared at harvest festivals, at weddings, and at the few feasts a peasant might know in a lifetime. Number 4 is the section of the medieval menu that proves no creature was safe. When meat was scarce, and meat was almost always scarce, peasants trapped whatever moved. Sparrows, larks, starlings, and blackbirds were snared in hedges and roasted whole. Hedgehogs were rolled in clay and tossed directly into the coals. When the clay was cracked open, the spines pulled away with the hardened shell, leaving behind a small pocket of hot, gamey meat. Eels from the rivers of England were so plentiful that they were sometimes used as actual rent payment to landlords, with entire villages valued in eels per year. They appeared jellied, smoked, and stewed on tables across England and Holland. Squirrels, frogs, and even crows ended up in the cooking pot when winter dragged on. Cookbooks dating from the 1390s describe in painstaking detail how to prepare nearly every small animal a peasant could conceivably catch, right down to the proper way to pluck a thrush. Number 3 is what happens when cheese is made not as a craft, but as a desperate attempt to use up scraps. Green cheese was nothing like the aged, prestigious wheels found in monasteries and noble pantries. It was a hard, sour, low-fat curd made from skimmed milk that remained after the cream had been churned into butter. Often it was rock-hard, frequently it was covered in mold, and almost always it was bitter enough to make the eyes water. Contemporaries described peasant cheese as being so tough that it could withstand the assault of a blade, a phrase that should not be read as poetic exaggeration. In Wales and Cornwall, it was shaved into pottage to add a sharp, salty flavor to the otherwise bland gruel. Wheels were stored for months in cool stone larders, where they grew steadily harder, more pungent, and more inedible by the day. Eventually, they were eaten anyway, because eaten anyway was the universal motto of medieval peasant life. Number 2 is the chapter of medieval history that nearly no one talks about. The Great Famine struck northern Europe between 1315 and 1317, and for 3 consecutive years, the harvests simply failed. Peasants ground acorns into bitter cakes, leaching them repeatedly in water to remove the tannins that would otherwise burn the throat. They boiled grass, weeds, and even old leather shoes and belts to extract any trace of nutrition the materials might still contain. Chronicles from England, France, and Germany describe travelers stumbling upon corpses in fields with green stains around the mouth, evidence of the desperate final meal. Monastic accounts from Ireland and Poland record outbreaks of cannibalism, with one chronicler writing that parents devoured their own children, and prisoners who were tossed into pits would tear apart the freshly arrived. An estimated 10% of the population of Northern Europe died across those 3 years. The famine ended eventually, but the memory of what people had eaten to survive lingered in folklore for generations. Number 1 is the meal they never knew they were eating, and it was the most disturbing of all. Studies of medieval skeletons at Cambridge revealed enormous quantities of roundworm, whipworm, and tapeworm eggs preserved in the pelvic soil that once held the intestines. The conclusion was unavoidable. Food and water across medieval Europe were routinely contaminated by human feces, used liberally as fertilizer in the fields where peasants grew their grain. Even the small ale that peasants drank instead of water, believing it safer, was brewed in unsanitary wooden vats that harbored their own ecosystems. Every bowl of porridge, every loaf of bread, every cup of ale almost certainly carried microscopic eggs and larvae that the eater never saw. The Augustinian friars of Cambridge, despite access to better latrines, showed even higher parasite loads than the general peasant population, likely because they fertilized their gardens with their own waste. Medieval physicians prescribed cures involving mercury and ground iron, treatments that were often more lethal than the worms themselves. Modern science has confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that medieval peasants were not dining on rustic charm. They were surviving on fermented sludge, rancid fish, fungus-tainted bread, sour curdled porridge, and worm-infested water drawn from wells too close to the privy. Every single bite was a small act of defiance against a world that seemed designed to kill them. Against the staggering odds, generation after generation found a way to keep eating, keep working, and keep going. Drop a comment below and tell us which of these 10 medieval meals you could actually stomach, and which one would have sent you running for the hills. If you made it through this entire grim feast, consider yourself officially tougher than the average modern stomach.